Most people who are careful with money will never be wealthy. Not because they lack discipline, but because the system they were taught was never designed to produce wealth in the first place. For thousands of years, before modern financial advice existed, ancient households built and sustained wealth across generations through a single structural principle that has almost no presence in what is taught today. Solomon understood it. Proverbs encoded it. And almost no one reading that text has extracted its actual financial architecture. The difference between a life of careful saving and a life of genuine financial authority is not the amount you earn, it is the direction you assign to what you already have. Saving money does not create wealth. Directing it does. If this challenge is something you were told was true, stay until the end. There is a specific kind of silence that follows years of discipline. Not the silence of peace. Not the silence of arrival. It is the silence of a man sitting alone, reviewing numbers he has maintained faithfully for over a decade, and realizing that the numbers are not enough. The accounts are intact, the habits are clean, the lifestyle is controlled. And yet, something fundamental is missing, something no one warned him about when he started down this path. He did everything correctly, and he is still not free. If you have ever felt that particular weight, if you have ever followed the advice, stayed consistent, reduced your expenses, saved with discipline, and still found yourself standing in the same financial position year after year, then what you are about to hear is not motivation. It is not encouragement. It is a structural diagnosis. And the diagnosis begins with a question most people never think to ask. What if the system you were taught was never designed to produce wealth? We live in a culture that has elevated frugality to the level of virtue. Cut the subscription, avoid the restaurant, save the difference, track every purchase. The language of financial wisdom, as most people have received it, is almost entirely a language of reduction. Remove this, eliminate that, protect what remains. And on the surface, this sounds reasonable. It sounds responsible. It sounds like discipline. But look carefully at what this system actually produces. Consider two individuals. Same income, same city, same general lifestyle. Both have been told the same things about money since they were young. Save aggressively. Avoid debt. Spend less than you earn. Both have followed that instruction with genuine consistency for the better part of 15 years. At the end of those 15 years, one of them has a savings account. The other has a portfolio of assets generating income, whether he works or not. The difference between them is not intelligence, it is not income, it is not even discipline, because both were disciplined. The difference is structural. One man was protecting money, the other was directing it. And those are not the same activity, even though they look similar from the outside. Reduction does not equal multiplication. This is the first truth this system refuses to teach you. Saving money preserves what you have. It does not create what you need. A man who reduces his spending from $2,000 to $1,000 has not gained anything. He has simply lost less. And there is a profound psychological difference between losing less and actually building something. One keeps you in place. The other moves you forward. The financial world has consistently confused these two outcomes, and that confusion has kept millions of disciplined people permanently stuck at the beginning. This is the modern wealth illusion, and almost no one questions it. There is an older record worth considering here. Long before modern financial advice existed, before savings accounts, before investment portfolios, before the entire apparatus of personal finance as we know it, there were households that built wealth systematically across generations. Not through luck, not through inheritance, not through aggression or risk-taking, through structure. The ancient wisdom literature of the Hebrew tradition contains a sentence that has been read for thousands of years without most people extracting its financial architecture. Proverbs, chapter 13, verse 11. The common rendering reads, "Wealth gained hastily will dwindle, but whoever gathers little by little will increase it." Most people read this as a warning against impatience, a reminder to be slow and steady. And while that reading is not wrong, it misses the more precise instruction buried in the original language. The Hebrew root of the phrase translated as gathers implies a process of deliberate assembly, the act of bringing separate pieces together into a unified whole, not merely waiting, not passively accumulating, structuring, designing, placing each piece with intention into a larger framework that grows over time. Ancient wealth was never accidental. It was built according to a system. The households that sustained wealth across generations did not do so because they spent less than their neighbors. They did so because they understood that money must be structured before it can be multiplied. They separated capital from consumption. They treated a portion of every inflow as permanently unavailable for spending, reserved by design, for a different purpose entirely. This is not a metaphor. This was an actual practice, a structural habit. a code built into the daily financial life of households that understood what money was for. They were not savers. They were architects of capital. Now here is where the assumption must be broken directly. Frugality is not a wealth strategy. It is a survival strategy. These are fundamentally different things, and the failure to separate them is the source of an enormous amount of financial stagnation. A survival strategy protects what exists. It is designed for scarcity. It is defensive by nature. When you are in a crisis, when resources are genuinely threatened, frugality is appropriate. It reserves, it steadies, it prevents collapse. But a wealth strategy does something different. It creates, it expands, it transforms what exists into something larger than itself. And for that to happen, money cannot simply be held. It must be moved, deliberately, structurally, towards something that generates more than it consumes. The frugal mind has been trained to see every outflow as a threat. Every expenditure is evaluated through the lens of loss. Should I have spent that? Could I have kept more? The internal question is always about protection, and this is the infection. Not a character flaw, not a failure of intelligence. A conditioning, a deeply embedded response pattern that treats financial safety as the highest possible outcome, when in reality, financial safety is only the floor. It is the starting condition, not the destination. Consider the worker who has spent years denying himself reasonable expenditures, accumulating a savings balance that gives him a sense of security, but who has never directed a single dollar toward an asset that compounds. He has protected his money faithfully. He has also ensured, almost mathematically, that it cannot grow beyond its own accumulation. His discipline has made him a careful guardian of a finite resource, not a builder of an expanding one. What you protect cannot grow unless it is deployed. Protection and growth require different actions. And the architecture of genuine wealth begins precisely at the point where you stop confusing the two. This is the mechanism. Let it be stated clearly. The reserve capital law. A fixed portion of every inflow of money is permanently reserved. It is never spent. It is never consumed. It does not pay for living expenses, entertainment, or convenience. It exists for one purpose only, to be allocated into assets that grow, produce, and compound over time. This is not savings. That distinction matters. Savings, as most people practice it, is money set aside for future spending. An emergency fund? A vacation? A purchase delayed? The intention behind most savings is eventual consumption, just consumption at a later date. The money is reserved temporarily, then released back into the cycle of spending. The reserve capital law operates on an entirely different logic. The reserve portion is not waiting to be spent. It is permanently redirected. It is capital that has been formally separated from the consumption economy of your life and assigned to the production economy. Once it enters the reserve, it does not return to living expenses. It moves only forward into ownership, into assets, into structured positions that generate returns. Wealth begins precisely where consumption ends and allocation begins. Not before, not somewhere in between. At that exact boundary, this is the structure ancient households understood. This is the architecture behind the gathering described in Proverbs. And this is the line that separates the saver who remains the servant of his own protected money from the allocator who begins to command it. The difference between these two identities is worth examining with complete clarity, because the distinction is not minor. It is everything. The saver defines financial success as the preservation of what he has. His primary relationship with money is defensive. He is always calculating how much he can keep, how much he can avoid losing. His decisions are driven by a fear of reduction. His sense of security comes from the number in his account, staying stable or growing slowly through additional income. The allocator defines financial success as the productive deployment of capital. His primary relationship with money is directional. He is always calculating where money should go next, what position it should occupy, what asset it should become. His decisions are driven by a structure he has built and maintains with discipline. His sense of security comes not from the number in his account, but from the assets his account has purchased, assets that exist and produce whether or not he actively works. Two people, same income, same city, same general intelligence, but entirely different financial outcomes, not because of luck or circumstance, but because of the identity they operate from when money arrives. You are not financially constrained because you earn too little. In almost every case, and this is a statement that requires careful consideration, you are financially constrained because you have not yet built the structure that directs what you already earn. The amount is rarely the primary variable. The direction is, and here is where something deeper begins to reveal itself. Because once you understand that wealth is fundamentally about direction, about where capital flows rather than how much of it exists, You begin to see a structural principle operating beneath the surface of every genuine wealth outcome. It is not enough to reserve capital. Capital must move correctly once it is reserved. And what it moves toward, the nature of the assets, the logic of the allocation, the design of the system, is where the real mechanism reveals its full architecture. That is what comes next. Money that does not move cannot multiply. This is not a philosophical observation. It is a structural fact, one that ancient merchants understood long before modern financial systems existed, and one that most disciplined people today have never been taught to act on. Because the same culture that trained you to save aggressively also trained you to treat held money as the goal. The number in the account is the achievement. The balance is the reward. But a balance is not an asset. A balance is a position of waiting. And money that waits does not work. Consider what happens inside the households that have sustained wealth across multiple generations. Not the visible households, not the ones performing abundance for an audience, but the quiet ones. The ones whose names you may never encounter publicly, but whose financial position has remained stable and expanding for decades. If you could observe their internal relationship with money, the actual decisions, the actual allocations, the actual conversations about capital, you would find something that contradicts almost everything common financial culture teaches. They do not obsess over saving small amounts. They do not track minor expenditures with anxiety. They do not define discipline as the daily act of denial. What they have built, instead, is a system of intentional movement. Capital arrives. Capital is immediately structured. A portion is reserved. A portion is deployed. The remainder funds the life. And this sequence, reserve, deploy, live operates with the consistency of a mechanical process, not an emotional negotiation. The wealthy are not careful with money in the way most people understand. Careful, they are intentional with it. These are different postures entirely. Careful implies hesitation. Intentional implies direction. Here is the second structural layer of the reserved capital law, and it must be understood with precision. Reserving capital is only the first act. The second act, the one that actually produces wealth, is deployment. Capital must be assigned to assets. Not eventually, not when conditions feel perfect, consistently, structurally, as part of the same system that governs the reservation. An asset, in this context, has a specific definition. It is not a possession. It is not something you own because it has monetary value. An asset is a position that produces something that generates returns. Income, appreciation, or compounding value over time without requiring your constant labor to sustain it. Real property that produces rent. Equity positions that appreciate and compound. Ownership stakes in productive enterprises. Instruments that generate yield. These are the destinations of reserved capital. Not accounts that hold money patiently. Not purchases delayed until they become purchases made. Positions that produce honest distinction between holding and deploying, between saving and allocating, between a defensive posture and a productive one, is the hidden lever that most financially disciplined people never pull. They build the reserve. They feel the security of the reserve. And then they leave the capital there, waiting. Slowly losing ground to time and inflation, while assuming that accumulation alone constitutes progress. It does not. Accumulation is preparation. Deployment is the actual mechanism. Direction creates destiny in finance. Where money flows determines what money becomes. And a man who has mastered the discipline of reservation but never learned the discipline of deployment has completed only half of the system. Now comes the moment of internal resistance, and it is worth addressing directly because it will arrive reliably, predictably for almost everyone who begins to understand this structure. The fear appears in a specific form. It does not announce itself as fear. It announces itself as caution, as prudence, as the reasonable concern of a careful individual who does not want to make an error. It sounds like this. What if I lose it? What if the timing is wrong? What if I wait until I know more? This is the frugal virus speaking, not in the voice of spending, but in the voice of hesitation, because the virus does not only encourage excessive caution about spending. At its deeper level, it encourages excessive caution about movement altogether. It trains the mind to treat stasis as safety. To believe that as long as capital remains untouched, it remains protected. But untouched capital is not protected. It is stagnant. And stagnation is not a neutral state. It is a slow form of regression because the world around the capital continues to move, inflate, and expand while the capital itself remains fixed. Discipline, properly understood, is not restriction. It is controlled movement. It is the structured, deliberate decision to move capital towards specific positions according to a predetermined logic, not impulsively, not emotionally, but according to the architecture of the system you have built. The fear of deployment is not a sign of intelligence. It is a sign of conditioning. And the work of undoing that conditioning is not primarily financial. It is psychological. It is the internal process of separating the identity of the protector, who measures success by what has not been lost, from the identity of the allocator, who measures success by what has been built. Here is where the anti-Husserl principle must be stated plainly, because it runs directly counter to one of the most pervasive ideas in modern financial culture. More effort does not produce more wealth. Structure does. This is not a comfortable statement for people who have been told that intensity, grinding, constant earning, and relentless productivity are the paths to financial freedom. And there is nothing wrong with productive work. Work is essential, and its value should not be diminished. But work without allocation is a cycle, not a progression. A man who earns significantly and allocates nothing is simply running faster on the same surface. His energy is real. His discipline is real. His financial position, however, does not advance in proportion to his effort, because effort alone does not create compounding. Structure creates compounding. The ancient merchant did not work every available hour. He built systems that worked in his absence. He acquired positions that produced without requiring his constant presence. He understood that there is a ceiling on what any individual can produce through labor alone, and that real expansion begins only when capital is structured to produce independently of that labor. This is not passive income as a modern slogan. This is a structural philosophy rooted in a very old understanding of what money is for. Money is not a reward for effort. Money is a resource that, when structured correctly, becomes productive on its own terms. And the individual who understands this stops asking how to work more and starts asking how to structure better. Effort without structure leads to cycles, not freedom. Calm, repeatable systems outlast intensity every time. At this point in the process, the identity shift becomes the central work, because understanding this system intellectually is not sufficient. Knowledge of a structure does not change behavior. What changes behavior is the adoption of a new identity, a new internal definition of who you are in relation to money. For most people, the internal identity is some version of the earner and the spender. Money arrives, money is managed. Some is kept, the rest is spent. The goal is to keep as much as possible. The measure of success is the balance. The identity that this system requires is different. It is the identity of the capital allocator. In this identity, money arrives and is immediately structured. Before a single expenditure is made, the allocation is decided. The reserve is confirmed. The deployment path is clear. And what remains after that structure is applied is what funds the life, not the other way around. You no longer decide what to save after you have spent. You decide what to allocate before you spend. The sequence is reversed. And that reversal is not minor. It is the entire mechanism. This rewires every financial decision that follows. Because once the identity of the allocator is adopted, every inflow of money is immediately evaluated through a structural lens, not, how much of this can I keep, but, how much of this will I reserve, how much will I deploy, and how much will I direct toward living. The internal shift from saving to allocating is permanent once it occurs. And it produces a relationship with money that most people never experience. Not anxiety about protection, but calm command over direction. You no longer protect money, you command it. The daily practice of this principle is simpler than most people expect. And that simplicity is intentional, because a system that is too complex to maintain consistently is not a system, it is an aspiration. When money arrives in whatever form, from whatever source, the first act is not to spend. The first act is to assign before any expenditure is considered. The reserve portion is identified and separated, not after the bills are paid, not after the regular expenses are covered. First, before everything else. This sequencing is not arbitrary. It is structural, because what happens to money before any decision is made about it is a reflection of what you believe money is for. If the first decision is about covering expenses, you have already defined the primary purpose of money as consumption. If the first decision is about allocation, you have defined its primary purpose as production. Small amounts follow the same logic as large ones. The scale is different. The structure is identical. A worker allocating a modest portion of a modest income is practicing the same discipline as a merchant, allocating a significant portion of significant revenues. The habit is not about the number. It is about the sequence. The sequence, maintained consistently, is what compounds over time into a position of genuine ownership. Daily decisions build silent empires. Not through dramatic gestures, not through single large bets, through the quiet, repeated application of a structure that does not require motivation because it has been built into the fabric of how money is handled. One final caution, and it must be stated with care. Impatience will arrive. It always does. Somewhere between the adoption of this structure and the point at which its results become visible, the mind will begin to question whether the system is working. The results will feel slow. The progress will seem invisible. And the culture around you will consistently offer the appearance of faster alternatives, louder paths, more exciting positions, urgent opportunities that seem to promise compression of the timeline. Do not mistake that urgency for opportunity. Proverbs understood this. The verse does not merely warn against haste, it reveals that wealth gained through acceleration tends to diminish, while wealth built through gradual structured assembly tends to increase. This is not poetic caution. It is an observed pattern across thousands of years of human economic behavior. The compounding that this system produces is invisible at the beginning. It becomes visible slowly. And then, at a certain point, it becomes undeniable. The structure does not change. The practice does not change. But the position it has built reveals itself over time in a way that no amount of intense short-term effort could have produced. Time, rewards, structure, not urgency. Patience here is not passive. It is a disciplined trust in the architecture you have built. Return, at the end, to where this began. A man sits with his numbers, years of discipline behind him, and the quiet realization that discipline without direction has not produced freedom. The ancient wisdom was never about saving more. It was about structuring differently. Proverbs did not teach the accumulation of protected reserves. It taught the gradual, intentional assembly of capital into positions that grow. The household that understood this did not think about money the way most people think about money today. They did not ask how much they could keep. They asked where it should go. They did not measure success by the balance. They measured it by the ownership. They did not serve the money they had saved. They commanded the capital they had structured. The frugal virus teaches you to protect. The reserve capital law teaches you to direct. And the distance between those two orientations is the distance between a life of careful management and a life of genuine financial authority. Those who only save money remain its servants. Those who direct it become its master. This is not a new idea. It is an ancient one. It has always been available. It has simply been obscured by the noise of a culture that confuses discipline with restriction and protection with progress. The structure is now clear. The mechanism is defined. The identity is available to you. What happens next is a matter of what you decide to become. They reserve capital law. Reserve first. Deploy into assets. Direct before you spend. Wealth is not what you keep. It is what you command.